Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. I'm here to guide you tonight through the quiet corridors of the past, where the rhythm of distant lives might just help slow the rhythm of your own thoughts. Find a comfortable position, settle into your pillows, and let the weight of the present day begin to drift from your shoulders. Tonight, we'll step through the heavy oak doors of a medieval monastery into a world measured not in hours, but in bells, not in individual desire, but in collective devotion. Imagine yourself leaving behind the noise and hurry of modern life. The year is 1150, and you are about to begin a year of silence, prayer, and profound simplicity. This will be a journey into stillness, into the patterns that shaped countless lives, and perhaps, as you listen, into the deep and restful sleep you deserve. The institution we explore tonight stands somewhere in the rolling hills of northern France, its stone walls softened by centuries of wind and prayer. The Benedictine order, with its ancient rule, provides the framework for every breath, every movement, every thought. As you enter, not as a visitor, but as a novice, one who has set aside the world to test the calling of monastic life, you find that time itself has been reborn. The day no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the community, to the ritual, to the eternal cycle of praise and labor. And it begins, as all monastic days begin, in darkness. Imagine yourself asleep on a thin straw pallet, beneath a rough wool blanket that smells faintly of lanolin and last winter's smoke. You have slept in the clothes you will wear all day, your habit, because undressing is a luxury the night does not allow. The dormitory is a long, cold hall, and around you, dozens of other men breathe in the deep, slow rhythm of sleep. Then the bell rings. The first notes are distant, floating across the monastery grounds from the tower, but they grow clearer, more insistent. It is the bell for matins, the first of the day's 8 services, and it tolls at the second hour after midnight. The year is young, and the frost is thick on the ground outside, creeping through the unglazed windows where wooden shutters barely keep the wind at bay. You sit up slowly. Your body, still not accustomed to this interruption of its natural rest, protests in whispers of stiffness. The floor beneath your bare feet is stone, and the cold of it bites gently at your soles. You reach for your sandals, simple leather things that have been worn smooth by countless feet before yours. Around you, your brothers are rising as well, their movements synchronized not by command, but by shared obligation. No one speaks. The great silence holds sway from Compline, the last service of yesterday evening, until Prime, the service that comes with the dawn. In these hours, your voice is not yours to use. You have been given words, the psalms, the hymns, the responses, but no words of your own. This silence becomes a blanket, heavy at first, then strangely comforting. You learn to hear your own thoughts more clearly in the absence of speech, though the thoughts, too, are meant to be turned always toward prayer. You file out of the dormitory with the others, your footsteps a soft shuffle on the stone. The corridor is lit by a single taper, its flame dancing in the draught, casting shadows that make the vaulted ceiling seem higher, the walls more ancient. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and cold stone, a smell that has become the background of your existence. You enter the chapter house, a large, octagonal room where the community gathers for these nocturnal prayers. The stone seats are arranged in rows, and you take your place among the novices, positioned according to your year of entry, your age, your standing. The cold of the stone bench seeps through your habit immediately, a familiar companion that you have learned to accept, though your knees still ache from yesterday's hours of prayer. The service begins. The abbot's voice, low and steady, leads the chant. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. The words are Latin, a language you are learning slowly, syllable by syllable. You sing because you must, your voice blending with the others into a single, sustained note that fills the space like incense. The rhythm of the chant is ancient, a heartbeat that has pulsed through this room for generations. You follow along in your psalter, your fingers stiff with cold, the parchment pages crackling softly as you turn them. The candlelight is insufficient, a yellow pool that barely reaches the text, and your eyes strain to distinguish the careful script. Your back, unaccustomed to the posture required, begins to register its complaint as a low, persistent ache between your shoulder blades. This is the first of the day's 8 moments of communal prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, and each will interrupt your labor, your meals, your brief moments of rest, reminding you that time is not yours to command. Imagine yourself now in the scriptorium, the room where you spend the heart of your day. It is mid-morning, The light through the narrow windows is at its strongest, though that is not saying much in the deep of winter. You sit at a sloped desk, your stool hard and unforgiving. Before you lies a parchment stretched and scraped until it is almost white, and beside it, your tools. A quill made from a goose feather, a knife for sharpening, a pot of ink that smells of iron and oak gall. You are copying the Gospel of Matthew, letter by letter, word by word, a task that will take you months to complete. The work requires a concentration so complete that it becomes a form of meditation. Your hand moves steadily across the page, forming each letter with careful precision, because a mistake is not merely an error. It is a failure of attention, a moment of pride or carelessness that must be corrected, often with a penance of extra prayers or a missed meal. Your fingers are cold. They are always cold. The scriptorium has a brazier, but the heat it offers is meager, a suggestion of warmth that does not quite reach your corner. You wear thin woolen gloves with the fingertips cut away, but still, the cold seeps in, making your joints stiff and your progress slow. The ink thickens in the pot, and you must warm it occasionally with your breath, leaning close and exhaling slowly, watching the surface shimmer and thin. The work is monotonous, but the monotony is the point. In the repetition, the mind is meant to find stillness, to turn away from worldly distraction and toward the divine. Yet your mind wanders, as minds do. You think of the bread you will eat at dinner, dense and dark, made from rye that grinds rough against your teeth. You think of the ale, thin and sour, that is your daily drink because the water is not to be trusted. You think of the vegetables in the garden, stored now in the root cellar, their flavors muted by months of preservation. These are the threads of your sustenance, simple and unvarying, and they leave you perpetually hungry, not with the sharp pang of starvation, but with a dull, constant emptiness that has become part of who you are. The rhythm of their lives, you are learning, is a rhythm of interruption and return. No task is ever completed without the call to prayer. You might be in the garden, turning the soil for spring planting, your fingers in the cold earth, when the bell rings for terce. You might be in the kitchen, helping to prepare the midday meal, a cauldron of pottage, thick with beans and onions, when the bell rings for sext. Each time you stop, you leave the task as it is and join your brothers in the church. The work will wait. The work always waits. This is the central lesson of monastic life. That nothing in this world is so urgent that it cannot be paused for prayer. The fields will still need tending, the sheep will still need shearing, the manuscripts will still need copying, but first, always first, comes the office, the cycle of praise that marks the hours and hallows the day. Humility is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Each week, you attend the chapter of faults, where you and your brothers gather to confess your failures before one another. You stand when it is your turn, your head bowed, and you speak your transgressions into the silence. That you fell asleep during the reading at meals, that you spoke unnecessarily in the cloister, that you failed to complete your assigned portion of copying, that you felt pride when the prior praised your script. The confessions are simple, factual, delivered without emotion, but the humiliation is real. You feel the eyes of the community on you, not with judgment, but with shared recognition of human weakness. Then comes the prescribed correction, perhaps a day of fasting, perhaps extra prayers, perhaps, for more serious failings, the discipline administered by the prior in the privacy of his office. A few strokes of the rod, delivered without anger, accepted without complaint. This is the system. This is how pride is rooted out, how the self is diminished so that God might increase. Absolute obedience is the rule. When the abbot commands, you do not question. When the prior assigns you a task, scrubbing the pots, mucking the stable, helping the infirmarian with a sick brother, you do not weigh its fairness or its difficulty. You simply go and do it, offering the work as another form of prayer. You learn to love the obedience not because it is easy, but because it frees you from choice, from the burden of self-will. The rhythm of their lives becomes your rhythm. The silence becomes your speech. The hunger becomes your sustenance. The cold becomes your warmth. This is the alchemy of monasticism, the slow transformation of suffering into devotion, of monotony into peace. Imagine yourself now nearing the end of your year as a novice. The seasons have turned completely. You have seen the monastery through a winter that seemed it would never end, through a spring of tentative green, through a summer of labor in the fields, through an autumn of harvest and preparation. Your body has changed. It is leaner, harder, more accustomed to the schedules and privations. Your mind has changed, too. It is slower, perhaps less quick to leap from thought to thought, more content to rest in the space between words. You have learned to find comfort in the predictability of the bells, in the shared silence of your brothers, in the slow emergence of each letter on the page as you copy the sacred texts. You have learned that the perpetual hunger is not an affliction but a reminder, that the emptiness of the belly can mirror the emptiness of the soul, the space cleared for God to fill. Tonight, as you walk to matins beneath a sky of brilliant, indifferent stars, you feel the familiar cold of the stone through your sandals, the familiar weight of the silence in your mouth, the familiar ache in your knees as you bend them for prayer. These sensations are no longer strangers. They are old companions, markers of a life you have chosen, or that has chosen you. The chant rises around you, the same words you have sung 8 times a day for 365 days, and you find that they have become part of you, woven into the fabric of your breath. You no longer sing them, they sing you. And now, as we leave the chapter house, as the last echoes of the nocturnal prayer dissolve into the stillness of the monastery grounds, we turn our attention to a figure who would emerge from within these very walls to challenge the world beyond them. A woman whose visions would shake the foundations of the church itself, whose voice would refuse to be silenced by the great silence. When you are ready, we will meet Hildegard of Bingen. Imagine yourself now in a different monastery, several days' journey to the east, in the Rhineland forests of what will one day be Germany. The year is 1170, and the rhythm of their lives is much the same. The bells, the silence, the stone floors, the perpetual cycle of prayer. But here, within these walls, something extraordinary has taken root. You hear her voice sometimes, rising above the others during the office, a voice that carries a quality you cannot name, part chant, part something else entirely. She is Hildegard, the abbess of this community, and she is like no other monastic leader you have encountered. To understand how she came to command such respect and such fear, we must go back nearly 60 years, to when she was first given to God. She was 8 years old when her parents brought her to the Benedictine monastery at Dissebodenberg. It was the year 1098, and the practice of offering a child as a tithe, a literal tenth of one's earthly goods given back to the divine, was not uncommon among the noble families of the region. Little Hildegard was the 10th child, and so she was marked for God from birth. You can imagine the scene: a stone church, cold even in late summer, the parents kneeling before the abbot, the child standing between them, perhaps not fully understanding that she would not return home. She was placed in the care of a noblewoman named Jutta, who had herself chosen the enclosed life, and together they were walled into a small cell attached to the monastery church. The door was sealed. For the next 30 years, Hildegard would live in a space no larger than a modest bedroom, sharing it with her mentor, sharing it with the silence, sharing it with visions that began almost immediately and never stopped. The visions came as light, she would later write, lux vivens, living light, that poured into her soul from heaven. She described them as swirling, concentric circles of celestial fire, as towering figures that spoke in voices like rushing water, as landscapes of jewels and stars that revealed the hidden nature of creation. Modern scholars, looking back across the centuries with medical knowledge she could never have possessed, have suggested that these visions might be explained by a neurological condition. Perhaps migraines with intense visual auras, perhaps something more complex. The symptoms fit: the flashing lights, the geometric patterns, the temporary blindness, the nausea that often followed. But to Hildegard, and to those around her who learned to trust her insight, these were not symptoms. They were revelation. They were the voice of God, speaking directly to a woman's soul, bypassing the hierarchy of the church entirely. The rhythm of their lives in that enclosed cell was even stricter than in the larger community. Jutta was an ascetic of the most severe kind, and she taught Hildegard to mortify the flesh, to deny comfort, to find God in the emptiness. They slept little, ate less, prayed constantly. When Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard, now 38 years old, was universally recognized as the successor. The monks of Dissebodenberg installed her as the magistra of the community of women that had grown up around Jutta's sanctity. But Hildegard's visions were becoming more insistent, more elaborate, and more difficult to contain within the walls of her enclosure. In 1141, during a particularly intense episode of lux vivens, she heard a voice commanding her, "Write what you see." She hesitated. Who was she, a woman, a nun unlearned in theology, to speak with divine authority? But the voice persisted, and she began to dictate what she saw to a monk named Volmar, who became her lifelong secretary and scribe. The result was the Civias, a text that defied every convention of her time. It was theological, but it was also poetic, scientific, medical. It described the cosmos as a cosmic egg, it detailed the medicinal properties of plants, it offered diagnoses and treatments for diseases that perplexed the physicians of her day. More dangerously, it spoke with authority. Hildegard did not write, "I believe this might be God's will." She wrote, "Thus says the living light." The manuscript, when it began to circulate, attracted the attention of the most powerful man in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian mystic who was the spiritual advisor to popes and kings. Bernard read her words, recognized the depth of her insight, and gave her his blessing. That blessing was a key that unlocked every door. If Bernard approved, then who could stand against her? She began to compose music. This was perhaps her most revolutionary act. The plain chant of the church was beautiful but rigid, a fixed system of modes and melodies that had remained unchanged for centuries. Hildegard wrote something else entirely, melismatic lines that soared like birds released from a cage, intervals that were considered dissonant and therefore forbidden, a vocal range that demanded more of singers than any liturgical music before it. Her compositions, collected in the Symphonia Armini Celestium Revelationum, were not meant for performance by professionals. They were meant for her nuns, for the women of her community, to sing as part of their worship. She created a new sonic world, one that reflected the swirling, visionary quality of her spiritual experiences. You can imagine the sound, a single voice rising, then another, creating harmonies that had never been heard before, filling a stone church with a strange, almost otherworldly beauty. But music was only one of her challenges to the established order. In 1150, she left Disibodenberg entirely, taking her community of nuns with her to found a new monastery at Rupertsberg, near Bingen. This was unprecedented. An abbess did not simply relocate her entire convent against the wishes of the male abbot who held authority over her. The abbot of Disibodenberg objected strenuously, but Hildegard had amassed enough political capital. Through Bernard, through the local archbishop, through the growing reputation of her holiness, that she prevailed. She became, effectively, an independent ruler of a small spiritual kingdom, answerable not to the local monastery, but directly to the Archbishop of Mainz. Her authority continued to grow. She embarked on 4 preaching tours between 1158 and 1170, traveling up and down the Rhine Valley, speaking to clergy and laity alike. This was a direct violation of canon law, which explicitly forbade women from preaching. But Hildegard did not ask permission. She was invited by local bishops, and when she spoke with such conviction, such apparent divine authority, that no one dared silence her. She denounced corruption in the church. She called out abbots and bishops by name for their moral failings. She warned of divine judgment. She was not gentle. She was not meek. She was a prophet, and she spoke as one who had seen the living light of God and could not remain silent. Her correspondence was vast. She wrote letters to Pope Eugene III, to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, to King Henry II of England. She wrote to abbots and abbesses, to theologians and physicians. The power struggle that would define her final years began over the burial of a man. In 1178, a young man who had been excommunicated died, and his family requested that he be buried in the cemetery of the Rupertsberg monastery. Hildegard, believing that the man had repented before death, allowed the burial. The Archbishop of Mainz, Christian I, objected. He claimed that Hildegard had violated church law by giving Christian burial to someone who had died outside the community of the faithful. He ordered the body exhumed and placed an interdict on the monastery, meaning that the sacraments could not be celebrated there, that the community was effectively cut off from the spiritual life that was its entire reason for being. Hildegard refused to comply. She appealed directly to the Pope in Rome, arguing that the Archbishop had overstepped his authority. But the Archbishop was powerful, and the Pope was distant. For months, the interdict held. The community could not celebrate Massachusetts. They could not hear the words of consecration. They could not receive the Eucharist. The rhythm of their lives, the cycle of prayer and worship that defined their existence, was broken. Hildegard's nuns suffered, and the blame fell on their abbess. But Hildegard did not bend. She wrote scathing letters to the Archbishop, accusing him of acting with the cruelty of a tyrant rather than the justice of a shepherd. She mobilized her network of supporters, including the Pope's own representatives. Finally, in March of 1179, the Pope lifted the interdict. Hildegard had won, but she was an old woman now, worn down by years of struggle, by the intensity of her visions, by the sheer effort of maintaining her community against forces that wanted to contain it. She died on September 17, 1179, at the age of 81, leaving behind a legacy that would be debated for centuries. She had been a mystic, a composer, a scientist, a physician, a preacher, an abbess, and a rebel. She had defied the church while remaining deeply devoted to it. She had shown that a woman's voice, if it spoke with enough clarity and conviction, could not be silenced, even in the most rigidly patriarchal age. And now, as we leave Hildegard's Rupertsberg, as her voice fades into the centuries, we turn our attention to the quiet rebellion of another kind. The small, subversive acts of resistance that took place in the scriptoria where men like you, the novice we imagined earlier, spent their days copying sacred texts. We will look at what they wrote in the margins, what they drew in the illuminations, what they hid in plain sight. When you are ready, we will explore the secret language of medieval manuscripts. Imagine yourself back in the scriptorium, the year of your novitiate nearly complete. The candle before you gutters softly, throwing its yellow light across the page you have been copying for 3 weeks. A psalter for the abbot's personal use. Your hand moves automatically now, forming each letter, each flourish, each gold-leafed initial that begins a new verse. The work demands complete concentration, yet concentration, over hours and days and months, becomes its own form of weariness. The mind, denied its natural wandering, finds cracks in the discipline through which to escape. And so, in the margins of these sacred texts, in the spaces between the holy words, another kind of writing emerges. Not the formal script of the office, but the whispered complaints, the private jokes, the subversive dreams of men who have given their lives to silence. The rhythm of their lives, you must remember, was one of constant interruption for prayer, but also one of constant interruption by boredom. The mind, starved of novelty, creates its own. And so, in the lower margin of a gospel book made in England around the year 1325, you might find a tiny figure, a knight in full armor, his lance couched, his shield raised, charging at a snail. The snail is not small. It is drawn to the same scale as the knight, its antennae waving, its shell a swirling spiral of careful ink. This image appears again and again in manuscripts across Europe, a private joke shared among scribes who would never meet. The interpretation remains uncertain, a gentle mystery for scholars to ponder. Perhaps the snail represents the petty irritations of monastic life, slow-moving, inexorable, impossible to defeat. Perhaps the knight is the scribe himself, armed only with his quill, tilting at the windmills of his own frustration. The image is never explained in the text. It exists in the margin, a visual sigh, a moment of levity in a day defined by gravity. Other images are more difficult to reconcile with the sanctity of the page. In a book of hours from France, illuminated around 1340, the marginal decoration depicts a nun. Not a demon, not a figure of lust, but a nun in full habit, harvesting from a tree that bears not fruit, but phalluses. She reaches up with a basket, plucking them as if they were apples, her face serene, her expression one of simple duty. To modern eyes, the image is shocking, obscene, a desecration of a prayer book. But to the medieval mind, it may have been something else entirely, a visual pun perhaps on the word virile, which could mean both masculine and life-giving. Or perhaps it was a more subversive statement about the repressed sexuality of cloistered life, a fantasy of fertility in a world defined by sterility. The image is never repeated in quite the same way. It appears once, a secret hidden in plain sight, preserved for 7 centuries by the very institution it seems to mock. Even more bizarre are the rabbits. In manuscript after manuscript, drawn by scribes from England to Italy, rabbits become agents of chaos and violence. They march in armies. They carry bows and arrows. They behead hunters with tiny swords. In one particularly detailed marginal illustration, a rabbit rides a snail, another appearance of that persistent mollusk, while holding a lance and shield, a parody of the noble knight. These images are not mistakes. They are too careful, too consistent, too widespread. They represent, perhaps, a world turned upside down, a carnivalesque inversion in which the hunted become hunters, the weak become powerful. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, where every person had a place, and that place was fixed by birth and by God, the image of a rabbit with a sword offered a psychological release, a fantasy of rebellion that could be sketched in ink without ever leaving the scriptorium. What these subversive images tell us about the repressed medieval mind is a question that scholars still debate with quiet fascination. The monastery was a place of absolute obedience, of enforced silence, of sexual denial. The frustration, the anger, the creative energy that might have been expressed in the outside world had to find other outlets. The margins of manuscripts became a safe space for transgression. A scribe could draw a bishop being bitten on the behind by a dog, a pope with the body of a monkey, a monk drinking himself into oblivion, and as long as these images remained peripheral, literally marginal, they were tolerated. They were jokes, after all. They were fantasies. They did not interfere with the sacred text itself, but they revealed the humanity beneath the habit, the individual beneath the vow of conformity. Sometimes the criticism was more direct, though still encoded. In a copy of Gratian's Decretum, the standard textbook of canon law, a scribe drew a figure in the margin wearing the papal tiara, but the tiara is depicted as a fishing basket, with smaller fish swimming inside it. The metaphor is not subtle. The papacy, the image suggests, is a net that captures wealth, a trap for the unwary, a vehicle for enrichment. Yet it is drawn small, almost affectionately, a wry observation rather than a revolutionary manifesto. Other images show monks and nuns playing games, dancing, engaging in behaviors that their rule explicitly forbade. These are not condemnations. They are confessions, perhaps acknowledgments of the gap between the ideal of monastic life and its lived reality. Mistakes, too, were preserved, sometimes deliberately. A scribe, copying a complex theological text, might realize he has skipped a line. In the margin, he would write, "Hic deficit pars." Here a part is missing, and then continue as best he could. These annotations become a form of communication across time, a way of saying to future readers, "I tried. I was tired. The light was failing." In one manuscript from the Abbey of St. Gall, a scribe has written in the margin, "Pessimus ist color." This ink is the worst, followed by a small drawing of a hand with the middle finger extended, a gesture that required no translation in the 12th century any more than it does today. Another scribe, in a moment of pure exhaustion, wrote, "Citharista non est." The copyist is not here, meaning, "I am not present, my mind has wandered, do not blame me for what follows." These are the human traces, the small rebellions of tired hands and wandering minds. Yet for all the subversion in the margins, the creation of these books remained an act of profound faith and extraordinary economic complexity. A single illustrated psalter might take years to complete and cost as much as a small farm. The parchment alone, made from the skins of 200 sheep, represented a significant investment. The pigments came from across the known world. Ultramarine blue, ground from lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan. Vermilion red, made from toxic mercury sulfide. Gold leaf, hammered so thin that a single coin could cover a page. The commissioning of such a book was a political act. A nobleman who ordered a book of hours for his wife was not merely providing a devotional object. He was displaying his wealth, his piety, his cultural sophistication. A monastery that produced a magnificent gospel book for the Pope was not simply honoring the pontiff. It was currying favor, securing privileges, establishing itself as a center of artistic and spiritual excellence. The politics of manuscript production were intricate. The abbot who oversaw the scriptorium had to balance the spiritual purpose of the work with its economic reality. Scribes had to be fed, parchment had to be purchased, pigments had to be imported. Some monasteries became famous for their scriptoria, attracting commissions from across Europe. The Abbey of Cluny, the Abbey of Monte Cassino, the Monastery of Christ Church in Canterbury. These became brands, names that guaranteed quality and prestige. The pressure to produce beautiful work was constant, yet the rule demanded humility. A scribe was not supposed to sign his work, not supposed to seek recognition. The glory was God's, not his. And yet, in subtle ways, the scribes left their marks, not just in the marginalia, but in the quality of their script, in the inventiveness of their illuminations, in the tiny, almost invisible details that declared, "I was here. I made this." Modern technology has begun to reveal secrets that even the scribes themselves may not have known they were keeping. Multispectral imaging, photography that captures wavelengths of light beyond human vision, has allowed scholars to peer beneath the surface of parchment, to see what was erased, what was written over, what was hidden. A palimpsest, a manuscript whose original text has been scraped away so the parchment can be reused, can now yield its secrets. In a manuscript at the Vatican Library, imaging revealed that a seemingly ordinary copy of a medieval prayer book had originally been a collection of ancient Greek poems, the ink chemically erased but not completely destroyed. In another, at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, the technology revealed a faint undertext. a letter, written in the scribe's own hand, complaining about the quality of the parchment he had been given, the stinginess of the cellarer, the cold that made his fingers stiff. The letter had been scraped away, presumably by the scribe himself, but the ghost of his words remained, preserved for 800 years, waiting for the right kind of light. Other discoveries have been more subversive. A copy of the Gospels, held in a library in Munich, was found to have an entire layer of drawings beneath the illuminated text, drawings that depicted the Pope as a donkey, the cardinals as monkeys, the whole hierarchy of the Church as a bestiary of folly. These images had been painted over with a thin wash of pigment, hidden so effectively that they were invisible to the naked eye. Why they were concealed, we cannot know. Perhaps the scribe had second thoughts. Perhaps a prior discovered the work and ordered it covered. Perhaps it was a private joke meant only for the scribe's satisfaction, a secret he took with him to his grave. The imaging reveals what he hid, but not why. The mystery remains a small, quiet rebellion preserved in light we cannot see. The margins of medieval manuscripts, then, become a map of the monastic psyche, a place where boredom and brilliance, piety and profanity, obedience and rebellion coexist. They remind us that the men and women who copied these books were not machines, but human beings with senses of humor, with grievances, with imaginations that could not be entirely contained by the rule. They drew knights fighting snails because they needed to laugh. They drew nuns harvesting phalluses because they needed to understand the contradictions of their own bodies. They drew rabbits with swords because they needed, if only for a moment, to imagine a world where the powerless held power. And they did it all in the spaces between the sacred, where no one was supposed to look too closely. And yet, not all monasteries were places of such austerity, such enforced simplicity. While you, the novice, struggled with cold and hunger and the weight of silence, other monks lived lives of extraordinary comfort and influence. Their scriptoria produced not just prayer books, but financial ledgers recording vast incomes. Their tables were laden with meat and wine. Their cells were warmed by fires that burned through forests. They wore silk beneath their habits and hunted with falcons on monastic lands. As we turn now from the quiet rebellion of the margins to the overt opulence of the elite, we find that the world of medieval monasticism had another face entirely. When you are ready, we will step into the scandalous world of rich medieval abbeys. Imagine yourself now leaving the scriptorium where you spent your year as a novice, walking out through the monastery gates and into the surrounding countryside. The fields you pass are not owned by the local lord, they are owned by the monastery itself. The peasants who work them are not free tenants, they are bound to the land that belongs to the church. This is a reality that would have been invisible to you during your novitiate, hidden behind the cloister walls, but it is the economic foundation upon which the entire monastic enterprise rests. By the 12th century, many abbeys had become feudal landlords on a staggering scale, controlling estates that stretched for miles, collecting rents, tithes, and labor services from thousands of souls. The Cistercian order, founded in 1098 with a vow of strict poverty, had within a century become one of the wealthiest corporations in Europe, their white-robed monks managing agricultural empires that generated fortunes. The rhythm of their lives, which seemed to you so defined by prayer and manual labor, had another rhythm running beneath it, an economic rhythm, the pulse of commerce and exploitation. The abbey you served owned watermills, fulling mills for cloth, fish ponds, vineyards, quarries, and entire villages. The peasants who worked these lands gave a portion of everything they produced, a tenth of their grain, a tenth of their vegetables, a tenth of their livestock. They were also required to provide labor, several days each week working the monastery's own fields, repairing its walls, hauling its stone. In return, they received protection of a sort and the promise of prayers for their salvation. But when harvests failed, when disease struck, when war swept through the region, the monastery's demands did not diminish. The tithes were collected with the same ruthless efficiency, whether the barns were full or empty. The consequence was suffering, quiet and chronic. You would not have seen it from within the cloister, but the perpetually hungry peasants outside the walls lived with an emptiness far sharper than the monastic fast. Now imagine yourself invited, not as a novice but as a guest, to a different kind of monastery. The year is 1300, and you approach an abbey in the Loire Valley, its towers visible from miles away, its walls enclosing not just a church and dormitory, but a complex of buildings that resembles a royal palace more than a house of prayer. The abbot here does not wear the simple habit you knew. His robes are of fine wool, dyed deep red, edged with fur. He rides to the hunt with a retinue of servants, his horse's bridle gilt, his saddle embroidered with silk. His private chambers have glass windows, an almost inconceivable luxury, through which sunlight streams in clear and golden, not filtered through oiled parchment or wooden shutters. There are tapestries on the walls, carpets on the floors, a bed with a feather mattress and linen sheets that are changed weekly. The abbot dines on meat, which his rule forbids, washed down with wine imported from Burgundy, served in silver cups. He keeps a mistress, openly though not officially, a woman who has her own rooms in a nearby manor house, a woman who has borne him children who will be provided for with church lands. This was not an aberration. This was the norm for many abbots of great monasteries by the 14th century. The position had become elective in theory, but in practice, it was a political appointment, often secured through family influence, bribery, or royal favor. An abbot controlled vast revenues, not just from land, but from the pilgrims who flocked to his monastery's relics, from the courts that paid for the right to be buried in his cemetery, from the annuities and endowments left by wealthy patrons hoping to secure a place in heaven. He was expected to maintain a household appropriate to his station, to entertain visiting dignitaries, to serve as a local magistrate and a diplomat. The vow of poverty was interpreted as a vow of corporate poverty. The monastery as a whole owned nothing, but the abbot, as its representative, lived like a prince. The contradiction was obvious, but it was also accepted. The world outside expected its spiritual leaders to display temporal power. An abbot who lived in genuine austerity might be admired by his monks, but he would be dismissed by the nobility as insignificant, incapable of protecting the monastery's interests. The financial corruption that funded this luxury was systemic. The monastery's wealth was supposed to be held in common, used for the support of the community, the relief of the poor, the maintenance of the buildings, and the glory of God. But the abbot and his officers, the cellarer, the chamberlain, the treasurer, had discretion over how that wealth was spent. They could lease monastery lands to their relatives at favorable rates. They could sell timber from the monastery forests and pocket the proceeds. They could lend money at interest, despite the church's prohibition on usury, by disguising the interest as a gift or a penalty for late payment. Some monasteries became full-fledged banking operations, handling the finances of local nobility, even of kings. The Knights Templar, before their destruction in 1312, operated the most sophisticated financial network in Europe, transferring funds from Paris to Jerusalem, issuing letters of credit that functioned like modern banknotes. Other orders followed their example. The rhythm of their lives now included the counting of coins, the negotiation of loans, the calculation of profit. The Cistercians, who had begun with such fervent simplicity, white robes, no decoration, manual labor for all, became the undisputed masters of the medieval wool trade. Their monasteries were established on marginal land, which they then transformed through careful management into prime grazing pasture. Their flocks numbered in the thousands, their wool was the finest in Europe, and they sold it at markets in Flanders and Italy for immense profit. The white wool of their habits became a symbol not of purity, but of commercial empire. They developed breeding programs, experimented with crossbreeding, created a vertically integrated industry that controlled every stage from sheep to shipment. The lay brothers, the conversi, did the actual shepherding and shearing, freeing the choir monks for prayer and study. The system was efficient, rational, and enormously successful. It was also a betrayal of the founding ideal. The Cistercian order had been created to escape the world. It had become a dominant force within it. Perhaps the most lucrative business of all was the trade in relics. Every monastery needed a saint, or at least a fragment of one, to attract pilgrims and their offerings. The competition was fierce. When a new monastery was founded, its first priority was often to acquire a relic by purchase, by theft, or by divine revelation. Relics were bought and sold like commodities. A fragment of the true cross, a bone of St. Peter, a lock of the Virgin Mary's hair. These were not merely devotional objects, they were sources of revenue. Pilgrims would travel for weeks to see a saint's shrine, to touch the reliquary, to receive a blessing. They paid for the privilege. They left offerings. They bought badges and candles and little vials of holy water that had touched the relic. Some monasteries became professional manufacturers of miracles. They would publicize a saint's power to heal, to grant fertility, to protect against misfortune. They would stage public cures, carefully managing the evidence, selecting those whose recoveries could be plausibly attributed to divine intervention. They would produce pamphlets, early forms of advertising, describing the saint's life and miracles. The line between faith and fraud was not always clear. and often it was deliberately blurred. A monastery that depended on pilgrimage income had a powerful incentive to ensure that miracles continued to occur with reliable frequency. The relic trade turned monasteries into centers of political intrigue. An abbey with a powerful saint could influence elections, secure land grants, intimidate rivals. Abbots served as advisors to kings, as diplomats in international disputes, as spies in the courts of rival nobles. The monastery of Saint Denis, just outside Paris, was not merely a place of prayer. It was the necropolis of French kings, the keeper of the royal regalia, the power base from which Abbot Suger directed the affairs of the kingdom while Louis VII was away on crusade. The abbots of Cluny controlled a network of priories that spanned Europe, creating a shadow ecclesiastical empire that challenged the authority of bishops and even popes. Information flowed through these networks along with money and goods. A monk traveling from one monastery to another might carry letters, reports, warnings. The cloister, which seemed to you a place of withdrawal from the world, was in many cases the information center of the region, its scriptorium producing not just copies of Augustine, but coded letters detailing the movements of troops, the intentions of princes, the vulnerabilities of rivals. The reform movements that tried to restore simplicity appeared again and again, like recurring dreams that never quite achieve reality. The Cistercians themselves had begun as reformers, reacting against the wealth and worldliness of the Cluniacs. The Franciscans, founded by Saint Francis in 1209, took a vow of absolute poverty, refusing even to touch money, living by begging and by the work of their hands. The Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Carmelites, each new order began with a call to return to the pure, apostolic life of the early church. But within a generation, the pattern repeated. The Franciscans became confessors to kings, administrators of papal policy, owners of libraries and universities. The Dominicans staffed the Inquisition, wielding spiritual authority with temporal power. The rhythm of their lives, which had begun in reaction against the corruption of the world, became the rhythm of the world itself. The monastery walls, which were meant to keep the world out, became instead the walls of a fortress protecting wealth and influence. The attempts at reform from within were equally futile. Popes issued decrees calling for abbots to renounce their hunting dogs and their mistresses. Church councils legislated against the accumulation of plural benefices. Monks holding multiple abbacies, collecting revenues from each without residing in any. But the economic logic was too powerful. A monastery that remained poor could not maintain its buildings, could not support its community, could not defend its lands against predatory nobles. Poverty, in the harsh world of medieval politics, was not a virtue, it was a vulnerability. And so the scandalous world of rich medieval abbeys continued, its contradictions unresolved, its excesses unchecked, its piety and its corruption inextricably intertwined. And now, as we step back from the opulent halls and the counting houses, as we leave behind the abbots in their fur-trimmed robes and the pilgrims pressing coins into the reliquary box, we find ourselves returning to the simple stone cell where we began. The contrast could not be sharper, yet both were part of the same world, the world of medieval monasticism, with all its austere beauty and its human frailty. As we prepare to bring this journey to a close, let us carry with us the sound of the bells, the feel of the cold stone, the sight of the tiny knight charging his snail, the memory of Hildegard's luminous visions, and the knowledge that history, like life itself, is never simple, never pure, always containing multitudes. And now, as we prepare to leave this world of stone and silence, of bells and visions, of hunger and hidden rebellion, imagine yourself walking back through the monastery gates one final time. The year is no longer 1150, or 1170, or 1300. It is tonight. The air is warmer, the sky is clearer, and the weight of wool and worship has been lifted from your shoulders. You carry with you not the burden of historical knowledge, but the gentle residue of lives lived in patterns so different from your own. The monk who rose at midnight to pray in the cold chapter house, his knees aching, his stomach empty, his voice joining the ancient chant. He is not you, and yet some part of his rhythm has settled into your breath. The abbess who defied popes and emperors with the authority of her visions. She is not you, and yet some part of her certainty has quieted the restless turning of your thoughts. The world we have explored tonight was not a simpler world. It was a world of contradictions, of faith and fraud, of austerity and opulence, of voices silenced and voices raised. The monks who copied sacred texts while drawing obscene marginalia were not hypocrites. They were human beings, finding space for expression within constraint. The abbots who lived like princes while preaching poverty were not necessarily corrupt. They were products of a system that required wealth to maintain power, and power to protect the vulnerable. The peasants who starved while monasteries feasted were not forgotten. They were part of a vast, slow-moving machine of medieval economy that no single person could control or even fully understand. History, like sleep, does not offer simple judgments. It offers patterns, rhythms, the quiet accumulation of detail that eventually becomes understanding, and then release. Imagine yourself now in your own bed, the weight of your blanket a comfort rather than a necessity, the silence around you chosen rather than imposed. The hunger you feel, if you feel any, is not the dull, constant ache of monastic fare, but the gentle emptiness that precedes breakfast. The cold you feel, if you feel any, is not the stone-bitten chill of a medieval dormitory, but the coolness of sheets that will warm with your body through the night. The thoughts that drift through your mind are not required to turn toward prayer, but may wander where they will, toward dreams, toward memory, toward nothing at all. The contrast between their world and yours is not a source of guilt or superiority, but a source of comfort. You have inherited their knowledge without their suffering. You have inherited their music without their silence. You have inherited their faith without their fear. The rhythm of their lives has become the rhythm of your night, a slow, steady pulse that carries you toward sleep. The sound of the bell for matins becomes the sound of your own heartbeat, measured and calm. The scratch of the quill becomes the sound of your own breathing, in and out, steady and sure. The cold stone beneath your knees becomes the soft mattress beneath your body, supporting rather than punishing. The great silence becomes simply silence, not an imposed discipline, but a natural settling of the world into night. The visions of Hildegard become the dreams that wait just beyond the edge of consciousness, not divine revelation, but the ordinary miracle of rest. And as you drift, perhaps you will carry with you one final image. Not the grand abbeys or the scandalous wealth, not the subversive marginalia or the defiant abbess, but the simple picture of a monk, any monk, closing his psalter at the end of Compline, blowing out his candle, and walking back to his cell in the darkness. He is tired, he is hungry, he is cold, but he is also content, in a way that does not require understanding. He has done what was required. He has sung what was appointed. He has lived another day within the pattern, and the pattern has held. Tomorrow will come with its own requirements, its own songs, its own small rebellions and surrenders. But that is tomorrow. For now, there is only the walk back to bed, the settling onto straw, the gradual release of consciousness into the shared silence of the community. You have made that walk tonight, in a way. You have followed the pattern, not of monastic hours, but of historical imagination, stepping into another life, seeing through other eyes, feeling through other constraints, and then returning to your own time, your own bed, your own breath. The journey is complete. The knowledge has been offered, not to change you, but to accompany you into sleep. The past, with all its complexity, has done what the best histories do. It has made the present more precious, more peaceful, more possible. So rest now. Let the stone walls dissolve. Let the bells fade. Let the hunger be filled not with bread, but with the simple fact of being here, being now, being safe. The medieval night was long and cold and full of prayer. Your night can be long and warm and full of nothing more urgent than rest. The past has done its work. The present is yours to inhabit gently until morning comes, not with the tolling of a bell, but with the soft light of a new day, bringing its own requirements, its own songs, its own quiet possibilities. Good night. May your sleep be as deep as the silence of the cloister, as peaceful as the end of Compline, as natural as the turning of seasons that governed every life we have touched tonight. The story is over. The dreaming begins.